In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was a corpse, still twitching. Its heart in Berlin beat with a frantic, delusional rhythm, but its limbs, the armies in the east and west, were being systematically severed. From the Vistula to the Oder, a force of over 2 million Soviet soldiers gathered, a storm of steel and vengeance poised to break upon the German capital. This would not be a battle for territory or strategic advantage. This would be a battle of annihilation, a final, apocalyptic confrontation between two ideologies that had unleashed a level of violence unknown to human history. It was a battle to end an empire built on hatred and to decide the fate of a continent. This is the story of the Battle of Berlin, the final, brutal act of the war in Europe, a clash that would extinguish one tyranny and give birth to another. The road to Berlin was paved with the ashes of 1,000 towns and the bones of millions. It began not in April 1945, but in the frozen hell of Stalingrad 2 years prior, where the German war machine had its back broken. It was cemented in the summer of 1944 with Operation Bagration, a Soviet offensive so devastating it annihilated an entire German army group and swept the Red Army to the very gates of Warsaw. By January 1945, the Eastern Front was a shattered line. The Soviet First Belarusian Front under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev had reached the Oder River, a mere 50 miles from Berlin. They paused, not out of weakness, but to consolidate. They were a juggernaut, but a weary one. Its supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles of devastated land. Facing them was a phantom army. The German Wehrmacht, once the most formidable fighting force in the world, was a shell. Its ranks were filled with old men from the Volkssturm, the national militia, and terrified boys from the Hitler Youth, handed Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and told to stop the Soviet steamroller. Sandwiched between them were the hardened, desperate remnants of the Waffen-SS divisions, fanatical to the end. The defense was commanded by General Gotthard Heinrichia, a pragmatic defensive specialist who knew the futility of his task but was determined to make the Soviets pay for every inch of ground. He wisely withdrew his main forces from the first line of defense on the Oder, predicting the massive Soviet artillery barrage would fall there, on empty trenches. In his subterranean bunker deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler lived in a world of fantasy. He studied maps of armies that no longer existed, ordering phantom divisions to launch counterattacks. He believed that the alliance between the Soviets and the Western Allies would fracture, that Berlin would be saved by a miracle. He dismissed retreat as treason and ordered a scorched earth policy, a decree for the destruction of Germany itself. The German people, he raged, had proven themselves weak and deserved their fate. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich was now presiding over its Götterdämmerung, its twilight of the gods, and he was determined to take the entire German nation with him into the abyss. At 3 a.m. on April 16, 1945, the darkness on the Oder River was split by a man-made dawn. Marshal Zhukov gave the order, and 20,000 Soviet guns and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously. The initial barrage was one of the most concentrated artillery assaults in history, a roaring, earth-shattering event that turned the western bank of the Oder into a churning, fiery hellscape. Then Zhukov unleashed his second psychological weapon. 143 anti-aircraft searchlights were switched on, their beams aimed at the German positions. The plan was to blind and disorient the defenders, but the effect backfired. The light reflected off the morning mist and smoke, creating a blinding wall that actually silhouetted the advancing Soviet infantry, making them perfect targets. The Silo Heights became the first killing ground. Heinrich's foresight had paid off. The main Soviet assault crashed into his second, stronger defensive line. The fighting was brutal in close quarters. Soviet tanks, unable to navigate the boggy ground, became easy prey for German Panzerfausts wielded by teenagers. The air filled with the screams of the wounded and the crump of explosions. For 2 days, the Soviet advance stalled at Silo. with Zhukov growing increasingly frantic under pressure from Stalin, who was being egged on by the rival Marshal Konev, racing north to claim the prize of Berlin for himself. To the south, Konev's first Ukrainian front had smashed across the Neisse River with greater ease. Stalin, in a calculated move of manipulation, informed both marshals that whoever broke through first would be given the honor of taking the city center. This ignited a furious competition between the two Soviet fronts. Konev's armies swung north, threatening to envelop Berlin from the south, while Zhukov finally breaking through the Silo Heights on April 19th after throwing in his reserves with a profligacy that cost tens of thousands of lives, drove relentlessly westward. The pincers were closing. The German Ninth Army, positioned between the two Soviet fronts, was now in danger of being completely encircled and destroyed. The road to Berlin was open. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the outer suburbs of Berlin were within range of Soviet artillery. The first shells began to fall on the city. There were no grand birthday parades, only the distant thunder of the front and the desperate scavenging of a starving population. In his bunker, Hitler emerged to the garden of the Chancellery to decorate a line of Hitler Youth boys, some as young as 12, for destroying Soviet tanks. It was a macabre pantomime of normalcy in a city descending into chaos. That same day, the first Soviet long-range guns began their systematic bombardment of Berlin, a drumbeat of doom that would not cease for 10 days. The encirclement was swift and merciless. Zhukov's armies assaulted from the east and north, while Konev's forces completed the southern pincer. On April 25th, a patrol from the U.S. 69th Infantry Division met advanced elements of Konev's 5th Guards Army at Torgau on the Elbe River, effectively splitting Germany in two. The link-up between East and West was a moment of celebration, but it also drew a line on the map. The Western Allies halted their advance, honoring prior agreements that left Berlin, now completely surrounded, as the Soviet Union's exclusive prize.
Inside the Berlin pocket, the German command structure disintegrated. The city was divided into 9 defense sectors, but coordination was non-existent. Command was a chaotic mess of Wehrmacht regulars, Waffen-SS fanatics, police, firemen, and the Volkssturm. The latter were a pathetic sight. Old men in ill-fitting uniforms, often without weapons, led by veterans of the First World War. They were sent to hold strategic intersections with little more than rifles and a few Panzerfausts against the might of the Red Army. The only hope for a breakout was the 12th Army, under General Walter Wenck, ordered by Hitler to march east and relieve the capital. Wenck, a realist, instead turned his army into a moving pocket, fighting his way to the Elbe to allow as many soldiers and civilians as possible to surrender to the Americans. For those in Berlin, no such escape existed. The Battle of Berlin was not a battle for a city, but for its corpse. The Soviet assault was methodical and brutal. They did not use standard infantry tactics. Instead, they deployed specially trained Sturm groups. These were mixed units of infantry, combat engineers, flamethrower operators, and tanks. Their method was simple and devastating. A building would be targeted. Tanks and self-propelled guns would blast the lower floors to create entry points. Then the infantry would clear the ground floor while combat engineers and flamethrower teams worked their way up, burning and blasting the defenders out of each room. It was close, savage work, where grenades, submachine guns, and sharpened spades were the weapons of choice. The Soviet soldiers, the Krasnoarmeyets, were driven by a potent mix of ideology, discipline, and a deep, burning desire for revenge. For 4 years, they had witnessed the unspeakable horrors of the Nazi invasion. They had seen the smoldering ruins of their own villages and the mass graves of their countrymen. This was their payback. The result was a tidal wave of violence that crashed over the city. Looting, rape, and summary executions became commonplace. It was a horrific, if predictable, culmination of the war of annihilation that Germany had started in the East. The German civilians, who had largely ignored or supported the regime's crimes, now became the victims of its catastrophic failure. The German defense was fragmented, but often fanatical in its desperation. Waffen-SS units, knowing capture meant certain death, fought with nothing to lose. They used the city's infrastructure to their advantage, sniping from rooftops, launching ambushes from the U-Bahn tunnels, and turning city blocks into deadly kill zones. The Volkssturm and Hitler Youth fought with tragic, misguided bravery. Many were cut down in their first and only engagement. The city's wide avenues, built for Nazi grandeur, became death traps, swept by Soviet artillery and machine gun fire. The only movement was through shattered buildings and the dark, flooded tunnels of the subway system, where desperate civilians huddled alongside soldiers and the rats. 50 feet beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, in a claustrophobic, damp concrete labyrinth, the final act of the Nazi drama played out. The Führer bunker was a world of its own, disconnected from reality, filled with the smell of diesel fuel, damp concrete, and desperation. Here, Adolf Hitler, aged beyond his years, his body trembling from Parkinson's, presided over the collapse of his empire. He was surrounded by a dwindling court of loyalists: Joseph Goebbels, the fanatical propaganda minister; Martin Bormann, his powerful secretary; and his new wife, Eva Braun. On April 28th, the final shred of Hitler's delusion was torn away. News arrived via a wire service report that his ally, Benito Mussolini, had been captured by Italian partisans, executed, and his body hung upside down in a Milan square for public desecration. The image terrified Hitler. He resolved that his body would never be put on display. That same day, he learned that SS General Heinrich Himmler, his loyal henchman, had been attempting to negotiate a separate surrender with the Western Allies behind his back. This was the ultimate betrayal. It shattered the last of Hitler's resolve. In the early hours of April 29th, with the sound of Soviet shelling shaking the bunker's foundations, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief, bleak civil ceremony. He then dictated his last will and political testament. In it, he blamed the war on international Jewry, exonerated himself completely, and appointed Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor. He expelled Himmler and Goering from the party. There was no admission of guilt, no remorse, only the same venomous ideology that had spawned the conflict. On April 30th, after a modest lunch, Hitler and his new wife said their final goodbyes to the remaining staff. They retired to his private study. A single gunshot was heard. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide by gunshot, while Eva Braun bit into a cyanide capsule. In accordance with his orders, their bodies were carried upstairs, doused in gasoline, and set alight in the Chancellery garden as Soviet shells rained down. The architect of the Nazi nightmare was gone. Above the bunker, the battle reached its symbolic climax. The Reichstag building, though gutted by fire years before and of little strategic value, held immense psychological significance for both sides. To the Soviets, it was the heart of the fascist beast. To storm it and plant the red banner on its roof would be the ultimate symbol of victory. On April 30th, the same day Hitler died, the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions of the 3rd Shock Army launched their assault on the building. The German defenders, a mix of SAS, Luftwaffe, and naval troops, fought for every corridor, every staircase, every room. The fighting inside the Reichstag was a primordial close-quarter struggle in near darkness, illuminated by muzzle flashes and the light from fires. Soldiers fought with bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools in the smoke-filled halls. The famous photograph of the flag being raised was staged the following day, after hours of brutal combat to clear the final pockets of resistance. The two soldiers who performed the act, Meliton Kantaria and Mikhail Yegorov, were chosen for their ethnicities, a Georgian and a Russian, to symbolize the unity of the Soviet peoples. The cost of capturing the ruined building was staggering, with the Soviets suffering thousands of casualties. But the image of the hammer and sickle flying over Berlin became the defining icon of the end of the war in Europe. With Hitler dead, the chain of command passed to Joseph Goebbels, who for a single day became the Chancellor of the Reich. He immediately attempted to negotiate a truce with the Soviets, sending General Hans Krebs, who spoke Russian, to parley with General Chuikov. The Soviet response was unconditional surrender. Goebbels, unwilling to accept this and determined to follow his Führer in death, and his wife Magda, made a horrific decision. On May 1st, she administered cyanide to their 6 young children in the bunker, murdering them because they deemed a world without National Socialism not worth living in. Then Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked up to the garden and committed suicide. Their bodies were partially burned by loyal SS aides. The command of the shattered city now fell to General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense area. A soldier who had done his duty to the end, he now faced the reality of a lost cause. On the night of May 2nd, he issued a general order to all German forces in Berlin to lay down their arms and surrender. The shooting, slowly, began to stop. Exhausted, emaciated German soldiers emerged from cellars and ruins with their hands held high. The Battle of Berlin was over. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, had lasted for 12. Its final battle had cost the lives of an estimated 80,000 Soviet soldiers, 100,000 German soldiers and Volkssturm, and tens of thousands of German civilians. The silence that fell over Berlin on May 2nd was the silence of the grave. The city was a landscape of unimaginable destruction. Mountains of rubble filled the streets. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, decay, and death. The survivors, mostly women, children, and the elderly, emerged from their cellars like ghosts, their faces blank with shock and hunger. They were the citizens of a vanished empire, now at the mercy of the revengeful victors. The Soviet soldiers, their bloodlust slowly subsiding, began the process of occupation, establishing order amidst the chaos. The price of the Nazi dream was a nation in ruins, its cities shattered, its people traumatized, and its very soul scarred. The final end of the war in Europe came on May 8, 1945, VE Day. In a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, and again in a ceremony in Berlin, the German High Command signed the instrument of unconditional surrender to the Allied powers. Celebrations erupted from London to Moscow to New York. But for the soldiers who had fought their way from Stalingrad and Normandy, and for the civilians who had endured the bombing and the horror, the joy was tempered by an overwhelming exhaustion and the grim knowledge of the cost. The war against Japan still raged, but in Europe, the guns were finally silent. The world that emerged from the rubble was fundamentally transformed. Europe, the center of global power for centuries, lay prostrate. Its empires, bankrupt and morally exhausted, would soon dissolve. The continent was now divided by a new, ominous line, the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union, having sacrificed an estimated 27 million lives, was determined to create a buffer zone of subservient states in Eastern Europe, including the eastern half of a divided Germany and Berlin itself. The United States, unscathed and economically dominant, stood as the leader of the West. The wartime alliance was dead, replaced by a tense, decades-long standoff known as the Cold War. In the ashes of the Holocaust, the world was forced to confront the depths of human evil. The Nuremberg trials that followed established a new principle in international law, that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The phrase, "I was just following orders," was rejected. To ensure such a catastrophe could never happen again, the United Nations was founded, a fragile vessel for the hope of a more peaceful world. The final battle that ended an empire did more than just destroy the Third Reich. It ended one era of human history and began another, an age defined by the shadow of nuclear weapons, the ideological struggle between East and West, and a solemn global vow, never again. It was a vow paid for with the blood of millions in the ruins of Berlin and across a ravaged world.